Today, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Becky Anderson, managing editor of CNN Abu Dhabi and host of Connect the World, CNN's flagship primetime news show broadcast weekdays from the UAE capital. And in case you're wondering about the backdrop today, you join me from our temporary broadcasting site at Expo 2020 in Dubai, where we are an official broadcaster. Right, let's get to it. 2021 looks set to be a year of recovery for the Middle East and Central Asia, but after a difficult economic and social crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, this recovery will take some time, and it certainly won't be straightforward. Risks such as inflation, mounting debt, unemployment threaten a retreat from post-pandemic growth. Divergent vaccine rollouts across the region have only hampered what are already struggling economies, but there could be opportunities to build more resilient economies using the lessons learned from the last 18 months or so. Expanding digital technologies, for example, reducing the role of the state, addressing climate change. These are key messages of the regional Middle East and Central Asia IMF team, which has released its economic outlook titled Trade-Offs Today for Transformation Tomorrow. Look, real GDP is projected to grow 4.1% in 21 and 2022, following the sharp contraction last year. But this growth is tempered by lingering risks from that pandemic and some familiar problems that have troubled some countries in this region for years. Well, joining me to give us an in-depth analysis into the outlook are my esteemed guests today. Firstly, Jihad Azor, who is the director of the IMF in the Middle East and Central Asia. Badr Jafar is the CEO of the Crescent Enterprises in the UAE. Sharif Kamal is the Dean of the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. And finally, Monica Malik, Chief Economist at Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Well, before we begin, and thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Before we begin, a quick set of house rules for you, if you don't mind, for our audience. This seminar is available in Arabic via the Zoom link. Audience members can also ask questions through our Zoom chat, some of which I will put to our panel towards the end of this conversation. Badr, let me come to you. The pandemic has hit some groups unequally, and Jihad alluded to this, women, youngsters, those who are less skilled. Small firms have been impacted massively, and yet we are seeing signs of recovery. Your business, well diversified across a number of strategic sectors, regionally and indeed globally, not least in energy, in logistics, and indeed in venture capital. From a private sector standpoint, what trends do you see emerging at this point?
So as has been highlighted in the IMF's report, and as you've just said now, the region's performance, as you look across its 20 or so countries, is as diverse as the 500 million or so people living in it. You just need to compare the scenes behind you at Expo in Dubai with what you're seeing three or 4 hours away in Lebanon to illustrate that. So it can be misleading, of course, to generalize MENA. The report's conclusions are clear. However, I'd like to highlight three other macro trends that I believe are very positive for the region, and if properly embraced, can have a major positive influence on its economic and socio-economic trajectory in the years to come. The first is the rise of venture capital. You know, we've been saying for years that the only way we can break the stubborn cycle of youth unemployment is by empowering small businesses to generate jobs. The problem is nobody wanted to invest in small businesses. Well, I hope that that's changing. In the last few years, we've seen record amounts of capital flowing to startups, over $1.2 billion in the first half of this year alone, which was a 60% increase on last year. Crescent Enterprises, our corporate venture capital arm, CE Ventures, has itself invested $200 million in the past 3 years, over half of which is in the region. Of course, we have a long way to go. The venture capital funding as a percentage of GDP in the MENA is 10 times less than the US. But the momentum is certainly there. And we now need to ensure that we allocate more capital to growth stage businesses, improve also the infrastructure to facilitate exits and returns on investments, and of course, improve regulation to make it easier for these businesses to raise money. The second point I'd like to highlight is the ESG phenomenon. For years, I've been saying the only way we're going to stand a chance at overcoming our numerous social and environmental challenges we face in the region is if we as businesses identify with the business case for adopting these principles as an intrinsic part of our business models. Again, at Crescent Enterprises, we've been reporting on our sustainability journey for 10 years now. And I really believe, Becky, that we're finally seeing a real conscious effort and shift in focus towards ESG and sustainability more broadly in the region, beyond just whitewashing. Now, this can be huge, as it could mean that we're recruiting hundreds of thousands of agents of positive change in the region, each with the potential to make an impact on the economic and social indicators that Jihad outlined. And finally, the empowerment of the private sector itself. Look, I mean, as we all know, trust is the most important intangible commodity in any society or economy. And as trust in business globally rises, well, at least according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, I'm seeing a similar trend in our region, with the private sector increasingly seen as an essential partner to achieve our region's nation goals. And this is even more relevant with the geo-economic pivot that we're also witnessing with related competition, of course, heating up. Take the UAE, for example, where one of the first of our principles of the 50 to mark 50 years of the Union is to completely focus on building the best and most dynamic economy in the world. Now, we've already seen streams of new regulation in parts of the region aimed at trying to make it easier for businesses to thrive. Of course, we must work harder to ensure that that empowerment is inclusive, both geographically as well as demographically. For example, I noticed reading the Arab Youth Survey for 2021 that around 80% of women surveyed say that they are concerned about the lack of opportunities to join the workforce. And this is a worrying trend that we must reverse with urgency.
Some extremely important points, Badr. As we move through and out of this pandemic, given the varying degrees of success traditionally by governments across this region in response to economic shocks, it's been very clear from this conversation and from conversations that you have around the region that this recovery needs businesses to be part of the solution. So, given your experience and your insight, do you genuinely believe that the private sector is doing enough to transform itself in the post-COVID world? Bottom line, can it have the impact that we've been discussing here?
So in many ways, the pandemic, I think, forced sectors to work together around the world. The vaccine drive is a clear example of a successful public, private, and people partnership. And without government incentives and effective regulation, private sector innovation, and community engagement, we would have seen many millions of more lives lost and economies and healthcare systems completely collapse. The MENA region is no different. And so I hope that the experiences of the past 18 months or so will provide inspiration as to the models of collaboration and cooperation that we need to see in the region if we are to overcome our most difficult challenges. As I said, businesses have no choice today but to be on the front lines of this mission. I've been preaching this for 20 years or so, but I think we're finally reaching a tipping point where profit is being seen as fundamentally compatible with social and environmental outcomes without it being a zero-sum game. And this is something that we must continue to encourage and celebrate. A final word on this, and it's one of caution, which is that as we move to empowering the private sector, we must also make sure that we promote a level playing field by ensuring that government doesn't inadvertently hamper business by competing with it. This, as far as I'm concerned, is the most powerful thing that regulators can do to allow business to do what it does best. as the IMF's report highlights, a key requirement for this transformational recovery of the whole region really is a reorient of the role of the state, with a focus on things like health, education, providing social safety nets, and very importantly, pursuing competition enhancing regulatory reform to identify and reduce fiscal risks whilst promoting private sector innovation and growth.
This has been terrific. I want to pause for just a moment to take some questions that have come in from the audience. People who've been sending them in while we have been chatting. Nasser Saidi asks if the panel can discuss the digital divide in the region and its impact on recovery and growing inequality. More importantly, he asks, how is working from home and learning from home being implemented across the region? Let me hold that thought. I've got another question here because we can divvy these out for answers. Another question from the audience asking about the role that fighting corruption could have in promoting growth in the region. What are the panel's views on that? Who wants to start? Jihad, let's start with you on either of those questions.
On the corruption point, look, corruption is a disease that will eat away at the fabric of the economy and our societies until they are dead. So there is no hope unless we root this out and we deal with it. It's a systemic issue, and it's one that has to be dealt with head on. As you know, Becky, we launched the Pearl Initiative about 10 years ago to look to promote the business case behind corporate governance and accountability, transparency, but also really dealing with this issue of corruption. What does it mean in our businesses, in our economies, in our societies? And how can we make sure we root it out? I've seen a change in attitudes to corruption more broadly over the last 10 years, but there's a lot more that we can do and need to do. And I'm talking about specifically the Gulf. Of course, as we've just discussed, the situation is very different and diverse as you go across different parts of the region. On just quickly, the digital question, the smartphone penetration in the Middle East and North Africa is amongst the highest in the world, pushing, I think, 70%. And many countries are taking digitization very, very seriously. The Gulf region alone plans to invest over $70 billion by 2024. And we know how transformative, effective digitization can be on all our systems, as has been mentioned, healthcare, education, and of course, commerce. Of course, we must make sure that as has been raised, that in parallel with physical and digital infrastructure, we're also investing in skills, digital skills, to ensure that we're using technology to its maximum potential, and importantly, using it to empower change makers to address our challenges. Just a final point I'll mention on digitization, again, something I was reading the other day, where 50% cost of available broadband exceeds affordability in 50% of developing countries, and an estimated 47% of people worldwide are still offline. Also, there's a huge gap in accessibility and access, I guess, to digital tools between large businesses and small businesses. And interestingly, women are also left out more often than not in many of these developing markets. So these are all areas that policymakers and businesses need to work together to make sure that we address.
The energy sector globally, Badr, going through a stark transition. The Gulf region, of course, still relies on fossil fuels. We are seeing evidence of that pivot, as I say. But how does the region's energy sector, and this will be a final question, transform while balancing what are the social contracts in this region, the economic, social, and indeed the environmental impact? Your perspective, if you will.
As you say, Becky, countries across the world are starting to experience the effects of years of confused energy policy, which led to an underinvestment in critical components of our energy system, and the resultant crunch that we're facing today, which is in turn putting a massive strain on energy importing nations globally. For years, I and many others have been advocating for sensible energy policy that supports a greener evolution of energy systems, whilst ensuring that we do not put energy security at risk or impede the economic and social progress of developing nations around the world. What this entails, broadly speaking, is First, an acceleration of the coal to gas switch, natural gas substituting for coal-fired electricity in the past 5 years reduced global CO2 emissions by 100 times more than all the electric cars in the world today. Second, cutting methane emissions, and fast. Methane is found in the atmosphere as only 0.5% of the volume of carbon dioxide, but it accounts for 25% of the temperature rise. Third, I think rolling out of locally fit for purpose renewables, whilst of course continuing to invest in R&D to bring generation and transmission costs down, and very importantly also develop economic large-scale energy storage solutions. And in the meantime, where intermittency is a problem, which it often is, then pairing renewable technology with gas makes huge sense. And then a stronger push towards greater energy efficiency, including by adopting new energy tech. Also, of course, encouraging more sustainable consumption habits. Eating habits is an interesting one. You know, the world today eats over 50 billion animals and 150 million tons of seafood every year, which accounts for about 15% of global emissions. And a final point, which my wife won't forgive me unless I mention, and that, of course, is protecting and restoring natural ecosystems. You know, deforestation accounts for about 15% of net global CO2 emissions. That's about the same as every single car, truck, bus, plane, ship, and train on the planet combined. And despite that, since 1990, we've been losing forest area the size of the UAE every single year. So again, this is all achievable, I think, with smart energy policy as opposed to politicized rhetoric. Right. And as you mentioned, Becky, the UAE's landmark net zero pledge and related strategy of going net zero by 2050, I think is a great example of a practical and conducive policy that relies on a mix of renewables, natural gas, hydrogen, and nuclear, of course, to ensure that the 3 A's of affordable, accessible, and acceptable energy is available to all.
For those who don't know, Badr's wife is a global leader in environmental issues. So you can now go home and feel that you will, the door will be wide open to you. So thank you for that. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed. What's clear to those who are watching this is that the digital divide, vaccine inequality that now exists, these issues need to be bridged. The public and private sector have so many lessons to learn from this pandemic. The risks are clear, but the opportunities are out there, aren't they? From here on out, collaboration key. That vaccine drive has been proof that businesses can do their part. Opportunities do exist in this crisis. Data-driven policies can help drive out corruption, as we've discussed, inefficiency, even improve governance. Governments can reform, moving away from broken practices. Energy efficiency is a goal that can be achieved as climate change becomes a bigger risk. All of this we have discussed. It's been an absolute pleasure having what has been a terrific panel today. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to our guests who have painted a clear picture for us of the challenges that the region faces, but also those opportunities that exist too. From me, Becky Anderson, it is a very good afternoon. Thank you.